Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, for being here. My name is Daniel Kinderman. I'm a professor of political science and international relations, and I direct the Center for Global and Area Studies here at the University of Delaware. For students in the audience, if you are not yet studying politics or majoring or minoring in the programs, one of the programs of CGAS, please do. This stuff is important, it's interesting, it's useful. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Kim Lane Scheppele, is that right, Scheppele? Back to the University of Delaware. She came once before in 2017 as part of the Global Populism Lecture Series that I organized. I wish the circumstances that surround your visit were not so serious. We are in a serious crisis. Our constitutional democracy is in danger. And what is the role of academics to help us to understand where we are, where other countries have gone, that were in a similar situation as ours, and different scenarios, how they might unfold. And for this task, I think there's no one more qualified than Professor Scheppele. She is one of the world's leading experts, maybe the foremost expert, when it comes to looking at how legal and constitutional instruments can be used and are often used to destroy democracy. Professor Scheppele is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton. She's the winner of numerous awards and distinctions, and she will give examples from Hungary, Turkey, Venezuela, Poland, Russia, India, and elsewhere, but also, of course, highlight our situation here in the United States. Thank you so much for coming and being with us here and sharing your insights with us. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Great, thanks so much. And it's nice to be back, like I said, and if there are any graduate students in the room, I will tell you what I tell my grad students, which is that when you're choosing what to specialize in, it turns out that often you pick a field that nobody cares about until the people you study are in pain. All right, and this is sort of, here we are. So, so we are in a difficult situation. My title, How to Lose a Democracy, implies that that can happen. And what I've been doing for the last 15 years, well, actually, let me say, what I did after the fall of the Berlin Wall was I went and watched democracies get set up out of dictatorships. It was a very optimistic time. We knew that not all of them were going to make it. You could kind of tell which ones didn't get a really great start, but there were a number of countries that really very quickly became democracies. And after that lovely burst of democratic enthusiasms, it turned out that many of the countries in the region joined the parade downhill. And I've lived and worked both in Hungary and in Russia. I worked at the constitutional courts in both countries. And so I've kind of ridden the escalator from democracy down into autocracy in two different places. And like I said, it was great when they were all going up and all my friends were happy, and then as things went down, and anyway, so it's not a happy situation, but it can happen. And that was something that in the 90s, if you read standard political science, the standard view was that once you became a so-called consolidated democracy, that was like the end of the road. And nobody thought anyone would ever give it up, So now we've seen that that's not true. And the question is really kind of how it happens. So let me start. This was the Atlantic magazine's cover in October, actually, before the US election in November. And it was a pretty dark and foreboding picture. And I think a lot of us thought the Atlantic was, or many people thought the Atlantic was overreacting. I must say that I didn't, because I've been studying this stuff and I was not really surprised at the result. But what I want to do is to get you all to think about government in two different ways. So one is the standard way, even in political science, that many people think about government, where it's a choice between left and right parties. On the left, you see, the Pew Research Center's estimate in 2021 of how the American public is kind of distributed across left and right categories. And looking at party politics, looking at policy choices, that's kind of the space of normal government. And that's stuff people fight over. You win an election, the other side gets the policy, then you win it and you get to pull it back. That's how democracies are supposed to work, is kind of on this terrain that I call policy, which is sort of left-right politics. But there's another way to think about government, and that is really what I think of as sort of regime type, or what form of government do you have? And in that world, the questions that we debate when we debate policy are not really as central. There, the big question is this question that the Pew Research Center periodically asks. I could only find a neat graphic that went up to 2018, but the US has reliably about 20% of its population that says problems could be dealt with more effectively if presidents didn't have to worry so much about Congress or the courts. That's the right-hand side. But what you'll see if you just look at these two things together is that, 75, 80% of the US public thinks that it would be too risky to give US presidents more power to deal directly with the country's problems. That's your good old constitutionalism, checks and balances, may be cumbersome, but it's dangerous to do it any other way. So this is where the American public is not divided evenly, as we are kind of left-right at the moment. But this is something where you really do have a lot of Americans in favor. By the way, if you look at the kind of democracies that wind up higher on the are you really a good democracy scale, that number is much smaller, the number of people. I mean, 20 is kind of high for a stable democracy to have people think that dictatorship might be a better form of government. But still, I mean, this is really not something about which Americans disagree so as much, right? So one of the things I would like you to do, and I should say I come from a family of homeless Republicans, and I live in a neighborhood where everybody except us voted for Trump. So my idea is not to sort of demonize the folks who voted for Trump in the last election, or who were genuinely conservatives, right? That's going to be a different debate than the thing that I want to talk about here, which has to do with how do you lose a democracy? What happens when checks and balances break down, right? So that means I have to talk a little bit about what's a democracy, what's an autocracy. All of you in political science will understand that there are whole bibliographies, libraries, tons of, and especially in political theory, devoted to this topic. And I've tended to use a fairly rough and ready definition, both of democracy and of autocracy. So I think of democracy as government not by whoever won the last election, but government by whoever will win some future election, where there's this actual possibility of the rotation of power. So it's not just whether the current leader has an electoral mandate. It's whether that current leader is willing to let go, like when the time comes, and to go into having another election. And the way that that happens is that power in a democracy has to have meaningful checks and balances so that it can't be captured by somebody who refuses to leave office. Adam Przeworski, the wonderful political scientist, has this famous phrase, democracy is for losers. By that he means that you can't have a democracy without people being willing to lose elections and accept the results. And so democracy is really about the rotation of power. And sometimes I use the phrase sustainable democracy to talk about democracies where you can guarantee those elections and the rotation of power off into the future. So one of the first mistakes I think people make when they ask, is my government an autocracy or not, is they're always asking about the last election, which I think it's not a backward-looking concept. I think it's a forward-looking concept. And the question is whether you can get to the next one and have a chance that power rotates if people wanted to, right? That's the test. So then, autocracy is sort of the opposite of that. So it's where you get power that can't rotate. Where people lose the capacity to switch leaders through elections. And there's also an interesting test, which we're now seeing in Poland, where you sometimes get a situation where a party can, like opposition parties can win an election, but autocratic movement has proceeded far enough that the prior government with autocratic ambitions still holds a lot of choke points, and the incoming government can't govern at all. Like, they just keep getting blocked, whatever they do, and then people lose faith in them and vote in the autocrats again. I'm really worried about that in Poland. So autocracy has different phases, but mostly it's about not allowing power to rotate. That means that typically power is concentrated in few hands without checks. And to rise to the lovely sloganeering of Adam Przeworski, I decided that we should call it Autocracy is for loners. That is somebody who wants to be at the top of the pyramid and not share power with anybody, okay? So that's gonna be the dimension that I wanna talk to you about today. Okay, so you can't read all of this because way too much happened. I write now for this, it's a Substack, but soon it will be a website and a YouTube channel, and it's already some podcasts. This new platform called The Contrarian, and my first column after Trump took office was this one, where I just tried to summarize like what he'd done in the first week. This was just the first week, you know, draconian immigration crackdown, abolishing federal anti-discrimination policies, declaring biological truth on gender, unsettling the leadership of the civil service, threatening the security of citizenship, stopping flow of funds to foreign aid and biomedical research, firing lots of independent officers and civil servants whose terms had not expired, removing the crucial watchdogs, remember all those inspectors general, undermining the security clearance system. You know, we can just go through the whole list, right? That was just week one. And so it was just a lot. And I think everybody's looking at this, and either you're saying, I can't keep up, like it's just every 10 minutes, or 3 minutes, it's something else. It's just a lot of stuff. Renaming the Gulf of Mexico, for example. All right, so then this is last week. I didn't have time to write it down, but this is just a few of the things that happened last week. So, you know, Elon Musk and his, I call them Muscovites in my column that just dropped yesterday. I work on Russia, so it's kind of a pun. But anyway, you know, Musk and his minions have actually entered all these offices that most people don't really know very much about. Office of Personnel Management, which is like HR Central for the whole government. This obscure office in the Department of the Treasury that actually sends out the checks or the electronic payments in our current, you know, form. They enter that. And something called the General Services Administration, which handles all the buildings, handles all the land, and handles all the IT systems. And they've been going in and sort of reprogramming the central databases. We think they may have just line item edited out some stuff, including on payments, the more we learn. There is a federal judge that just issued an injunction, by the way, yesterday on OPM, on the Office of Personnel Management, this morning on Treasury, that limits what Musk's people can do in the databases, but they'd already had 5 or 6 days of access, right? And we also know Musk moved a new server into the Office of Personnel Management, and they're running all the databases of the federal workforce through a server which was introduced without passing government security checks. And the system is so insecure that once they developed this email program where every single federal worker could get messages directly from OPM Central, it had no security, so everyone discovered if you reply to all, it goes to everybody, and people have hacked into the system from the outside. So the records are, I mean, it's all connected through a totally insecure system. That's just this week, okay? And then there's the stuff with the FBI. They may fire up to 5,000 or 6,000 agents because they want to get rid of everybody who investigated not just Trump, but all the January 6th defendants. The Justice Department has been massively shaken up. The entire leadership of the National Security section of the Justice Department has been reassigned to things they don't know how to do. Lots of prosecutors have been fired. I mean, this is the whole law enforcement apparatus is kind of in disarray. Obviously, USAID has been totally defunded. They've called back 7,000 people to arrive immediately. And Trump thinks he owns Gaza. So just a lot of stuff, right? And this is just a tiny fraction of like all this stuff. Okay, so what everyone says to me is like, okay, this is the question. So it's obviously chaotic. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on. But is democracy actually in danger, right? Is this just, I mean, every new government comes in with new policies. You know, you get whipsawed on certain things. This is obviously bigger than most of those transitions, but is it dangerous, I guess, is the question. And this is where I want you to think about triage, to sort of sort through the different types of things that are going on. Okay, so, because I want to teach you how to recognize the danger signals of autocracy, which are going to be different than the danger signals of policy. And by policy, I mean, you may not have voted for this particular government, you may hate what they do, but there'll be an election and then you get to win next time. Okay, that's democracy. Okay, that I'm not going to fuss with. It's the entrenchment part. It's the getting power into a few hands and not letting go. Okay, so how do you triage? So the first thing you have to do is discard distractions. One thing that aspirational autocrats do is they know what attracts press attention and they just do it. Okay, so I'm not really worried about Greenland. I mean, Greenland has its own problems, but and ditto with Gaza. I mean, like, anyway. But I don't think the U.S. is going to own Gaza. I don't think Trump's going to build hotels on the sea. You know, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. But this is days and days of headline press coverage that is not covering the other stuff, right? And when I worked in Hungary, Viktor Orban at the beginning, when he was consolidating power, knows that the neuralgic spot in Hungary is anti-Semitism. The Hungarian government in the 1930s was openly fascist, sided with Hitler during the war, participated eagerly in the Holocaust in Hungary, which killed between 500,000 and 600,000 Hungarian Jews. Obviously, anti-Semitism is still rampant in Eastern Europe. What Orban would do whenever he was going to do something that was a power grab, he'd get his people to erect a statue to some raving anti-Semite from the 1930s. All the liberals, all the political opposition would run over and demonstrate at the statue, and in the meantime, they would shovel all this technical legislation through the parliament that consolidated power in Orban's hands. In fact, it got to the point that the slogan works better in English than Hungarian, where I would say, every time you see a statue, look for the statute, right? Like they were literally using it to cover so that the press wasn't there covering what was happening in the parliament, okay? And that's a standard tactic of aspirational autocrats, so you just have to get rid of the noise. Okay, then the next thing, and this is where probably, you know, I guess many of you in the room are there, the current chaos is causing people a lot of pain. We're all, you know, in universities trying to advise our students who are either here on foreign visas or who are undocumented about what to do when ICE comes. You know, they removed the restriction on going into schools. And you can see they're doing sort of demonstration raids in sanctuary cities and blue states just to prove they can. There's going to be a lot of pain and suffering that comes along with the gender, the insistence on biological sex as the only way to think about gender, a lot of the uprooting of equality initiatives that have been really important in trying to bring underrepresented minorities into the mainstream, all of that. I mean, there's a lot of pain that this is causing. Sometimes pain is also, I mean, it's part of how these regimes operate to, again, sort of make everybody in fear that maybe it's going to come to me next, right? If you remember, you know, Pastor Bonhoeffer, you know, first they came for and then it goes down and then I'm the only one left. So partly it's designed to like single out really vulnerable people with the idea that if you speak up, you're next. And so it's a fear tactic. But that by itself is not autocracy. There's this third bucket, and that's what I want to pay attention to today, and that is this focus on the concentration of power. Because again, if autocracy is about the concentration of power in the executive without checks so that it doesn't rotate, all this other stuff is not doing that. I mean, it's doing other stuff, okay, and it's bad if you don't, you know, but this, I want to focus on this concentration of power, focusing on checks and balances, okay. And this is the other thing I think that it's important to realize. Many Americans, especially, you know, Americans have the great fortune of, if you've grown up and lived mostly in this country, you have not experienced dictatorship. So you don't know what it's like. When the Soviet Union collapsed, one of the things that also collapsed was the constant education about alternative systems and how they worked. So certainly my students, my graduate students, even my junior colleagues, just don't know what it would be like. And they don't think it's possible, because they don't believe it's ever happened here. And then they have this idea, right, which is, well, if it's going to come as a coup, right? It's tanks in the streets, it's somber music on the radio, it's, you know, some putsch that is obvious. And what you see, actually, this is a little chart that shows you in gray the attempts, in red the successes of coups. The gray shaded area tells you the Cold War, which is actually when coups were pretty popular, because a lot of them were proxy wars between the US and the Soviet Union. And since the end of the Cold War, you know, coups are really down. This ends in 2016. There's been a flurry of coups in the coup belt in Africa since that time. But by and large, coups are not what's going on when democracies collapse. So that's not what, it's not going to come like that. So just, that's not how it comes. How does it come? Democracy dies now by law, okay? And what do I mean by that? It happens when you get an elected leader who comes to power and then does things under cover of law. Okay, whether it's really legal or not, we'll address some of that, but basically it involves chipping away at the constraints on the executive. It involves dismantling checks and balances. It involves taking all the constraints, and every government is slightly organized differently about exactly what constrains the executive, but you can tell you're in trouble when the autocrat takes aim at all of those things. The Varieties of Democracy project, which many of you will know, is really probably the gold standard on, the state of democratic health in countries around the world. And they did a study of what they call major extensions of executive power, like when suddenly the executive gets lots and lots of power. And this was a study that was published in 2018. Between 1990 and 2018, as they found, 70% of all major extensions of executive power were permitted by law, and half of them were accomplished not by new law, but by reinterpreting old law. Okay, so that's the way it's going to come when it comes. That you shouldn't be looking for tanks. You should be, you should be looking for lawyers. Okay, and so lawyers are the agents of this stuff, and so it's literally lawyers engineering the unsexy stuff of government that affects like how power actually works. So when democracies die these days, they die a legal death. All right. And who are the democracies in trouble? So this is again a VDEM diagram. It's a lot of little dots, but the thing to note, it's the Varieties of Democracy project has this thing called the Liberal Democracy Index. It's a lovely index actually because it includes measures of the freeness and fairness of elections. It includes measures on whether rights are actually enforceable, but particularly it includes measures about constraints on executive power and the state of checks and balances. Is there an independent judiciary? Is the parliament actually functioning? Has the president overreaching, and does someone push him back? Like all those kinds of indicators, and they stick it all in one nice index. Along the bottom axis here, it's the Liberal Democracy Index for all these countries from 2012. And on the vertical axis, it's 2022. I could have picked up to 2024, but like this one I think conveys it best. If you're above the line, you got better, and if you're below the line, you got worse. Okay? It's also slightly out of date. I wouldn't put Georgia above the line right now. So, I mean, there's some countries that move, but I picked this particular sequence because if a lot of countries, started failing, like in Hungary, for example, started failing in 2010, you have almost a decade before for Venezuela. Ecuador went down, came back up again. So which 10 years you pick depends on which countries are failing. They kind of fail in a sequence. So this one, the book I'm writing now is studying the countries below the line, but particularly the countries below the line in the top half, like, see if I can do this. Yeah, so like these countries, the ones that are still kind of democracies but have become less good democracies. So the question is what's going on in that set, okay? So then, how does a country lose a democracy? These are some of the places that I study. I always love my picture of Trump and Orban because Orban's taking credit for Trump's victory if you read the Hungarian papers. All right, so when you look at all these countries, like it turns out there's a kind of playbook. There's a set of things that happen. They may not all happen in the same order, but I'll walk you through mostly what the order looks like. And they take a variety of forms because governments are organized differently, but this is the playbook. The first step might be surprising. To win an election fair and square. Now, it turns out that democracies that are in good shape have the same first step, right? If you have a free and fair election, some of the autocrats that I study, I went back and looked at what the election monitor said in the years that they were elected, all fine. Okay, so where you're going to see the problem is not actually in the election that brings the aspirational autocrat to power. There are some things about the election system. I mean, oftentimes disproportionality in the election system throws the election to an aspirational autocrat who didn't win a majority, think Trump won, but also think Orban, and even in 2010. So, so there are some disproportionalities that contribute to this, but mostly you're not going to look in the free and fair election. Okay, so then what? Capturing the parliament, or Congress in our case, and how does that work? So one of the ways it works is by enforcing party loyalty, so that whoever the executive is can really demand party loyalty. This can happen in some really interesting ways. So one of the first things that Viktor Orban did when he came to power in 2010 was he had his parliament, with the support of the opposition, I might say, pass a constitutional amendment to cut the size of the parliament in half, okay? Parliament had 450 people, country is 10 million, it's a very big parliament for a very small country. It would save money, lots of people had proposed cutting the parliament in half. Great. Then, how do you draw the new districts? Okay. First of all, it gave Orban a big chance to gerrymander the whole country, but second, he could go to his members in the parliament and say, half of you won't be here next time. If you want to keep your job, you will vote for everything I say. So it comes in some odd ways, okay? So how do you develop party loyalty? That's one of the things. Or the parliament just gives up power to the executive. You know, the really famous case, not contemporary, is Hitler's Enabling Act, you know, right shortly after he comes to power, giving him unlimited power to do whatever, but that's not unusual. It turns out that very often you get a new government that rode in on the back of some crisis. The you know, aspirational autocrat goes to the parliament and says, look, you know, I'm going to need all this power, you know, bullies them into giving this person a lot of power or being able to use emergency powers. I don't have to be able to come back to you because everything's going to happen really fast. And parliaments just give up power, just astonishingly. Also, you see executives grabbing power, and the parliament is just, well, what can we do about it? You know, or like, I don't want to, you know, hurt my guy because we're coming up to an election and, you know, he's still popular. So you see parliament acquiescing as the executive entrenches on their power. And then in some cases, you know, the parliament itself will just be dissolved or prorogued. Some of you will remember from Brexit when Boris Johnson, who I might say whose democratic credentials were never totally clear to me if he'd been able to stay in power, not sure what he would have done, but, you know, to avoid losing a vote on whether to leave the EU, he just suspended the parliament so they wouldn't vote on it. Okay, now the court pushed back in the UK, but, you know, that was really, then the court got attacked. So, you know, it's a dangerous game when you start to have this, but this happens all the time. All right, next, capturing the courts. And this usually happens by changing how judges are appointed. So the obvious thing is, you know, court packing or just expanding the number of judges on the high court. Erdogan pioneered a really interesting technique. What he did was to first change the Constitutional Court Act in Turkey to give that court, their highest court, tons more cases. More human rights cases. The EU was thrilled. This was when Turkey was still, you know, maybe an accession country. That was taken seriously as an accession country. Okay, so flood the courts with lots and lots of little human rights cases. Then Erdogan says, gee, we need more judges. And then when he put all these judges on, there was almost nobody who said this is court packing, but that's what it was. So Viktor Orban borrowed the same technique the year later. Okay, because it just passed muster. Changing the system of selection for judicial appointments. This is something that happened in Poland, where all the judicial appointments in the ordinary courts goes through something called the National Council of the Judiciary. You just change the composition of that appoints the judges. This is what Netanyahu tried in Israel. People came to the streets and so far have pushed it back, but not very successfully because they're doing other workarounds now in Israel. But again, changing the system of judicial appointments. In Hungary and then in Egypt and then in Poland, the government's just announced a new rule that judges now have a new retirement age. These are countries that have civil service judiciaries. You go to law school, you take the judges track, you become a baby judge, you get promoted. So when you lower the retirement age, you lop off the entire senior leadership of the courts. And in Hungary, they went from 70 to 62, effective immediately. 15% of the judiciary is opened up. They can put their own people into the leadership jobs. So successful in Hungary that Mohamed Morsi, remember him, in Egypt adopted the same, although he was thrown out of office before they could enact it, and then they did it in Poland. Again, these tactics, the other thing is the tactics spread. They all know about it. All right. So then, we've been through the parliament, we've been through the courts. So the next thing is civil service, because it's very hard to govern with a civil service that resists you. And so what you see is all over the place, aspirational autocrats will find ways to suspend civil service protection under a pretext. You'd be surprised how often austerity is used. You know, we have to cut government funds, we're spending too much money, we have a giant deficit, and so therefore we have to cut the bureaucracy, and the civil service law gets in the way. So you suspend it, you make some kind of exception, you do a government reorganization because there may be some opt-out in the civil service law that says if your whole department disappears, you can be fired. In Russia, they called it creating a vertical of power, where you wanted people who were appointed by the president all the way through to make sure the orders got all the way through. So that kind of fussing with the bureaucracy to make sure that loyalists are in the right position. This can mean altering the balance between career civil service and political appointees. And so essentially what the aspirational autocrat wants to do is to turn the professional bureaucracy into a partisan bureaucracy. And that's sort of the goal. All right. Systematically removing checks on executive powers. There are so many things in this category. I'm thinking about breaking it up into subcategories. But one thing you see is autocrats love to govern by decree. Even if they have a friendly parliament, they often don't really want to use it. and, you know, but still governing by decree, hobbling oversight mechanisms. So if there are transparency requirements, reporting requirements, you know, anything where the autocrat has to account for himself to anybody, they suspend the person, the office that's supposed to be auditing. They file fake reports. They just don't file reports. Say, make me, and then who can? So oversight mechanisms go by the wayside. Good government rules, ethics rules, financial disclosure requirements, conflict of interest rules, they just ignore them, okay? Capturing or disabling independent authorities. Election commissions are a big target. Audit offices, you know, you can often go after your enemies by, you know, subjecting them to abusive audits. Prosecutors' offices, nothing like prosecuting your enemies. Refusing to recognize or obeying court orders, sometimes with elaborate, you know, sometimes they just refuse to obey, but sometimes they appeal again, they, you know, do it and they try it again some other way. I mean, various ways of evading the courts. Firing executive branch employees who challenge the leader, so purifying, you know, what we saw in Russia, which was the clear sign of where Putin was going, was that he bypassed all of his cabinet officials and created this immense office of the president, the presidential administration, and all the power was centralized because he didn't trust people that weren't there, and he could hire all the people directly into his office. And then when I say assert powers of the legislature, I mean just start doing things that actually are their job, not your job, and then you dare them to stop you, right? So just all this blowing past guardrails and constraints and so forth is a really characteristic, maybe the most important step in the process. Filling crucial independent positions with loyalists, particularly in the repressive offices that can harass or jail enemies of the leader. So what you see is often a shakeup in the police, in the military, in the intelligence services, the leadership to make sure it's loyal to the autocrat, sometimes also the reporting relationship. So for example, again, Viktor Orban came to power, didn't trust the police, created a new anti-terrorism police that reported directly to him, that then got all these additional powers and extra pay and became the elite police force. But as soon as you saw it reported to him and not through the interior minister, whom he didn't trust, you could see that something was going on. Capturing the prosecutors is a big thing, because again, if you can investigate and prosecute your enemies, you can harass them, even if you can't convict them. If the courts aren't all in your pocket yet, just bankrupting them with investigations actually works pretty effectively. It also means that your side is safe. Like, you don't investigate and prosecute the people on your team, and it's a kind of reward for loyalty. Capturing the tax enforcement office or various forms of regulatory harassment is another thing. Anybody who's ever been through a tax audit knows it's right up there with like being accused of a crime in terms of like, even if you're innocent, it's just miserable. So all these things that states can do to harass the opposition. Harnessing the media as an echo chamber. Again, oftentimes when autocrats come to power, it's because they already control a piece of the media, because it's really just hard to catapult yourself into that kind of position without some kind of cheering squad behind you. But once you're in power, you get new levers to control the media. And, you know, in light of the general respect for freedom of the press around the world, I keep saying to my friends who do human rights, look, you've won. The thing that the autocrats don't do is obvious human rights violations. I mean, sometimes they do, but the autocratic capture part does not usually involve mass human rights violations. So they're not going to go in and, you know, close down the newspapers with a police raid, okay? So how do they ensure the public hears a steady supply of government information? So what they do is they operate on the economics of the media. You know, so one thing that Viktor Orban did was set up a media regulatory council that had various rules it was supposed to enforce about fair and balanced news coverage, and then they started fining all the newspapers that weren't praising Orban enough. But more crucially, they discovered that all of Budapest had 12 newspapers, daily newspapers, when Orban started, and now they're down to only a few. How did they get rid of them all? They just dropped the state advertising. Turns out state advertising was a big chunk of revenue for all these papers, and nobody has a right to get grants from the state, so they can't win a lawsuit on that. So they just dropped the state advertising, and then they started threatening the big advertisers that if you advertise there, you will never get a state contract. So it goes after the economics. And then a lot of the people who own media own a lot of other things that the state can also harass. So, you know, going after the oligarchs' other economic interests in order to get them to bring their media to heel is another thing that you typically see. I'm almost done. I have 10 things, and then I will turn to the US. defunding and threatening the civil sector and political opposition, okay? It turns out that, and we're seeing it actually with the budget cuts here, a lot of the people and a lot of the organizations that could push back against a government rely very heavily on tax breaks, state subsidies, and public grants. It's how democracies function. They don't control everything directly. They outsource. They pay other groups to do things, social services, and a lot of those groups are civil sector groups that could actually form a kind of democratic insurgency, shall we say, against an autocratic capture. But if they're all defunded, it makes it much harder to do that. You also see waves of defamation cases and other lawsuits. And you've seen that already, as you know, in this country, as Trump and his minions have, you know, brought defamation cases against almost everybody. That's a way to bankrupt people. Again, it doesn't matter if they don't win. The process is the punishment, right? And you can bankrupt somebody with a single libel action. Subjecting civil sector groups to intrusive tax audits, regulatory harassment, ensuring that political parties are deprived of income and publicity. Again, a lot of it's state subsidies, especially in really good democracies that have state funding. Like one of the things, again, the Hungarians did was they'd have an election and the election monitors would come in and they'd see everybody got state funding. And then at the end of the election, after the monitors left, the audit office would say, and all the opposition parties violated the campaign finance rules, we will cut off all your funding until the next campaign. So then they're deprived of funding for all the time between elections that they need to maintain a party structure. And then the next campaign starts, they fund them again, the election monitors come in and say, look, it all looks fine. That's what they've been doing. Okay, and then one of my favorite ingenious tactics that they use is to criminalize actions of the civil sector. And we've now seen, because immigration is such a hot button issue, what Hungary started and Poland picked up on is to actually criminalize the actions of people who help undocumented people by charging them with trafficking. If you look at the legal definition of trafficking, it means getting people to cross a border illegally. Okay, so if you're helping somebody who's undocumented, anyway, so they've been using anti-trafficking laws to go after the people who help migrants. So there's a lot of ways to harass the opposition. Private violence, so this is something, again, that we miss if we're just looking at the historical cases where you get, jackbooted, shock troops. The way autocracy works now is it usually works through privately violent groups. There are groups that are allied with the autocrat who can be brought in to knock heads. The crucial thing here is not that the police go in and do it. The police are withdrawn so that the bullies get to do it. I could just say January 6th, but they were beating up police, but the National Guards were withdrawn. They weren't sent in, right? Orban did this repeatedly with early sort of raids on Roma to prove that just the police weren't there for 3 days as gangs went in and knocked heads. Putting targets on the back of people who criticize the government. So, either withdrawing their security details, announcing that they have no security, publishing, doxing, like publishing where they live and saying go after them, and then allowing the other groups to do so. So autocrats these days don't usually lead the militias, they just allow the militias, but they withdraw the police who could stop them. And open cooperation, in Hungary it's football hooligans, in other countries it's private militias. And then finally, especially before the next election, just rewrite the election laws so that the next election is not free and fair, okay? What's interesting is that very few of these autocrats ever cancel elections, right? That's not on. That would be a clear signal to the international community. But what they do is they use various election law tricks, gerrymandering, voter suppression. A lot of these things involve somehow avoiding proportional representation, because after you've done this for a few years, there's enough people who want to vote against you that you might not get majority support. Election coercion, especially threatening loss of government benefits if you vote in the wrong way. Physical violence, and then when all else fails, just stealing elections. Okay, so that's the script, and then I'm just going to run you through, okay? Yeah, this is just this morning, okay? You all recognize the Department of Government Efficiency. Okay, so the question is, is what we're seeing that, or is it just, for those of you who are nervous, is it just because you didn't vote for Trump, right? I want to separate those two things. And this is where I really hope that maybe some of you did vote for Trump, because, I think that we're really entering some dangerous territory. We can do that by going through the contrast between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Okay, when Trump was elected the first time, what happened? So, separation of powers kind of worked. It's not that his government, not that the Congress didn't do much, and the courts sometimes reined him in. If you remember the Muslim ban, and there were a few issues where the courts actually pushed back. But we have had for many years in this country not a separation of powers, but what Rick Peldes and Darrell Levinson have called a separation of parties. So we're almost like a parliamentary system in which the governing party's allies in the parliament are always acting like junior partners of the executive and not really preserving congressional power. So we already had that before, that was there. And so that was one question. But in his first term, Trump really changed very little law. That's what's so interesting. He had a Republican majority for the first 2 years. Apart from budget, tax cuts, nothing. He loved executive orders. And the thing about an executive order is the next president can come in and reverse it. It's not as permanent a change as statutes. So he didn't really do what autocrats do, which is to kind of entrench this stuff by law. This was the one place where he had a big effect on judicial appointments. He got 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, 2 of which I think we could say were irregular in the sense that he gets the first appointment by announcing his party in Parliament, announces the rule that in an election year we can never elect a new justice, even though it was quite far from the election, and we had plenty of cases where that had happened. So they stalled the thing until after the election to catch that, and then there was another opening that happened right before the next election when the Republicans were still, and they captured that one, even though by the same rule they just announced. So this was irregular, shall we say, and got 3 votes. And these judges have really changed the court, and I won't go on about all the detail, but All right, but I kept saying to people, and they thought I was slightly crazy, Trump 1.0 was not that dangerous. He was chaotic, he did a lot of things that if you're on the left of the spectrum you didn't like, if you were on the right you might have. But in terms of actually really harming the institutions of a democracy, apart from sort of capturing the Supreme Court, which is big, the rest of it was not that damaged, right? And I kept saying, he was like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who governed in exactly the same way, kind of chaos and executive orders and dropping things on the floor. But you could then, vote him out of office, as Bolsonaro was in Brazil, because he wasn't entrenched, because he didn't change enough. And of course, even in the Electoral College, of course, we know that Trump didn't take this well, but his folks didn't win, right? They certified the election. Afterwards, we now know that what was interesting, and what was really interesting to me about January 6th was not just, this, which is to say the private violence, right? And the fact that the National Guard, remember, because Trump is still in charge at this stage, National Guard's not called in. They're allowed to ransack the Capitol for hours before there's really help. Classic authoritarian kind of pattern. But eventually, Congress reconvened. His own party condemned him. They certified the election. But then as you started delving more deeply into what was behind it, it turned out it was an elaborate legal plot, this fake electors plot. And I must say that was the first time I really got nervous, because it was like Trump discovered lawyers. And I told you that it's not soldiers, but it's lawyers who do the work of autocracy. And what you could see with this was a classic autocratic plot, right? Where you read the law, you stretch it a bit, you figure out how to get these fake electors, you take advantage of the immensely complicated and stupid Electoral Count Act, which has since been amended, but not enough. We had a very rickety system that took advantage of all the ricketiness, and it might have worked, actually. I mean, you could see how close it came. This was when I started to get nervous. All right, so now we have Trump 2.0. And again, my flags, red flags went up when I read Project 2025. I read the whole 900-page thing. And the thing that struck me was, this sounds exactly like Viktor Orban. It really was almost a direct copy of what Orban did between 2010 and 2013. And then, as I kept mentioning this to reporters, and a reporter for the New Republic actually tracked it down to the ground and discovered that Orban's English language think tank, which is called the Danube Institute, had a formal memorandum of understanding with the Heritage Foundation, and they were writers of it. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I only work with evidence, and this is first I read it and I thought, wow, this sounds familiar, and then I found the fingerprints. And then Orban has been claiming in his speeches in Hungarian that he's been directly involved in writing Trump's plan, okay? So that's one thing. That said, Hungary is a small country with a unicameral parliamentary government and only one real check on the executive, namely the court. It's easy to knock over, given how few moving parts there are. The US is big and federal and complicated and bicameral parliament and lots of checks, and it's not the same thing. And so, you know, but the opening salvo looks just like Orban, because the first thing he did was to reclassify, lifts the civil service law, fires tons and tons of civil servants, cuts the budget to target all of his potential opponents. That was like day one of this. Okay, but let's go through the script. Congress. If you recall, you know, one of the things that Trump claimed right after the election was he's going to nominate all these people. They need instantaneous approval. Why doesn't Congress go into recess so he can make recess appointments? Again, my flags go up because some lawyer told him that, right? I mean, even law students don't really know that part of the Constitution. So somebody had told him, you can do this. You can get all your people through under recess appointments. And then Congress didn't do it. Okay, and we still don't know the whole story about why they decided to hold hearings. His party was in charge in both houses, but this is a little bit of pushback. That said, since the nominees have been going through, not really much pushback, including nominees that really would have been outrageous, probably even to the people voting for them, if they were in any other world. Okay, so Congress is, you know, not holding tight completely. Okay, the courts. Mixed picture. So on the top is the headline from when the Supreme Court issued that decision on presidential immunity, which basically makes the president, whoever the president is, but now we have a president who may want to use it, immune from criminal liability for violating criminal law in the context of his work. No legal scholar thought that was possible. That wasn't even what Trump was arguing. This went way beyond what Trump's side even asked for. So this is a sign, the danger signal to me, that the Supreme Court is all on board with expanding executive power. And that's all the other, I mean, however important everything else they've done, Dobbs, guns, I mean, you know, you can think of all the other stuff that if you're on the left you found deeply worrisome. This is the autocratic piece, okay? The other stuff is however important policy, right? So the court is kind of on board with expanding executive power. That makes me nervous. But these last two headlines are yesterday and today. And so what you've seen is that as this pile of executive orders has been rolling out, a lot of them are just patently unlawful. And the courts have said so. Like almost every challenge has stopped something. So the first one is on the restraining order is on freezing all the funds. Two different judges have said that. The one on the bottom is the birthright citizenship. We've had two courts say that. As I was on the train coming down here, I got the news that there's been a temporary restraining order against Musk's people having read and write access to the Treasury database. Last night there was another judicial order that said Musk's people can't have read and write access to the personnel database. So far, and there's tons of lawsuits. In fact, there are hearings this afternoon on whether the FBI has to comply with the order to list all the people who were involved in January 6th hearings. I mean, so at the ground level, the courts are kind of saying, what is going on, right? And so far, the courts are holding at ground level. The worry is what happens when it goes up. Civil service, well, if you know anyone in the federal workforce, you'll know that they haven't had a good few weeks. And so part of this is just that everyone's been offered early retirement and early resignation in a way that is not legally enforceable. And if you know any federal, I mean, anyway, as I was coming down on the train, there now is a judge in Boston that has issued a pause because the fork in the road memo was the one that went out to all the federal employees saying, you have a choice. You can resign by February 6th, which as you might notice is today, or, you know, you'll be downsized, fired, and stuff without benefits, right? So as of this morning, about 40,000 federal workers had apparently taken this early resignation, even though every lawyer who's looked at this says it is not a legal act. Like, it looks like the thing that Musk sent to all of his workers at Twitter when he fired them. And firing people in the private sector is a really different thing than firing people in the public sector. And so, you know, it just, anyway, so, and so the Office of Personnel Management under Trump leadership has said the president has the authority to nullify regulations protecting civil servants, which I suspect the courts may push back on again. But civil service is obviously a big vector of attack. Checks on executive power, so many issues. I just put the headline, Trump barrels through guardrails, daring courts and Congress to stop him. I mean, a lot of the executive orders, again, just as a formal lawyer, reading these things, a lot of what Trump is doing in these executive orders is overriding statutes, acts of Congress, with an executive order. Okay, now, irrespective of the content, you learn the first day in law school, Constitution, statutes, regulations, executive orders, nothing lower can override anything higher, right? It's just like how the system works. And a lot of these executive orders ignore or override or pretend to dominate statutes, which is shocking. And then all of his people that he's imposed in various offices are now doubling down on that. I just gave a lecture, all the people, my colleagues in the natural sciences at Princeton said, you know, we're not political, but you come talk to us about what just happened to our grants, you know. And so, and I pointed out to them, like I went through all the regulations about National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. There are literally requirements in the statutes, like the things Congress has said, that said, for example, if you're doing clinical trials on, you know, on people, you have to take into account race and gender. And now the new anti-DEI rule says you cannot take into account race and gender, and we're going to check all your publications on the way out the door, because if you mention any one of a number of words, one of which is female, you will have your paper pulled. And it's like, okay, so which is it, the statute or the executive order? So, and I said to the scientists on my campus, I said, look, you are getting caught in the middle. You know, anyway, so, and they're doing this with the executive order. So that's actually really, and they're looking for loyalty. They're looking for people to follow the executive orders instead of the laws that they know. There's a whole bunch of conflict of interest questions, and then that's just sort of the Musk piece, like who is this guy and what is he doing, and what are all, by the way, today, if any of you are planning a trip by plane, you should know that today the Musk people went in and they hooked up their unsecure servers to the Federal Aviation Administration computers. Yesterday it was the National Weather Service. Okay, so loyalists in key roles. So I'm just focusing in this slide on the Justice Department, but you could really run it through the whole government. But I'm particularly worried about what happens with this new capture of the Department of Justice. Pam Bondi, when she testified in her confirmation hearing, said, I will not weaponize the Justice Department. And then she turns around 5 minutes later, issues this memo that says we are now weaponizing. It's called the Weaponization Working Group, actually, that she's forming in the Justice Department to go after everyone who prosecuted or investigated Trump or any of the January 6th defendants. And then Kash Patel, who looks like he's going to clear the Senate hurdle, actually published a book last year in which he has an enemies list in the back, where he lists all the people that he would go after if he was FBI director, so it's not really a mystery. And so the worry here is that the Justice Department is the investigation and prosecution arm where you can do a lot of harm to people, but it's also the enforcement arm. And one of the other memos that Pam Bondi sent out yesterday was one saying, essentially, we will no longer enforce FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is the law that prohibits people, the law that requires people who are in the employ of foreign governments to declare themselves as such before they interact with the US government. And now they're just not going to enforce it. So it's like open season on foreign powers buying people who then can act without disclosing their foreign ties. That was another memo yesterday. Media. So even before Trump took office, there was this parade, partly because Trump just sues everybody for libel, and then as he came closer and closer to taking office, media companies, which are typically now owned by oligarchs who have other business interests, were realizing it's just better to settle and pay Trump than to fight it, even in cases where every lawyer would tell you Trump had no case. So again, you're seeing this, that there was this famous ABC settlement. That was a libel action that nobody thought Trump would win. CBS now has been, you know, the Justice Department asked to turn over the entire 60 Minutes Harris interview because they've been alleging that CBS edited it in such a way as to give her, anyway. Meta, which is now basically, I mean, many people get their news through Facebook, just paid $25 million to Trump. So you're seeing all these media oligarchs just paying rather than fighting Trump. Civil sector, so everybody in the university sees this coming, right? So first it's defunding all the federally funded science. I'm at Princeton. Our leadership is very worried about the proposal to tax endowment incomes. There's going to be a whole bunch, if they abolish the education department, there go Pell Grants. There's just a lot of ways universities are going to be squeezed in this. He's also going after unions. So Biden had put in place a lot of protection for union organizing. Trump now says we will not honor any of that. And then, of course, there's the grants to scientists, but what this is doing to scientific research, completely apart from universities. But if you think about where is the opposition to Trump going to come from, it's sort of educated people, union organizers, institutions like universities, and they're all kind of being hit. And then in terms of private violence, of course, one of the first things that Trump did was to pardon all the January 6th defendants, felons, even the ones who had committed really extraordinary violence, even ones who had been convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is a very serious crime, punishable by, I think, Stuart Rhodes was in for, 18 years? And some of the worst ones just had their sentences commuted, but they're all out. And they're all out and seeking revenge against the people who testified against them, right? And this is really a worry. You probably heard some of the people who were witnesses in these trials talk about how terrified they are. The witness protection program is run by the Trump Justice Department, so they're not going to get protection. And then there's the other thing where there are a number of former officials that offended Trump who had, like Pompeo and Bolton. They were not exactly liberals, for those of you who don't recall their political background, but they were critical of Trump, and they had security detail because there was credible threats that because they participated in the first Trump administration's missile strikes on some of the key leadership in Iran, that Iran has a vendetta out for these guys, and they were under security protection because the threats were credible. And Trump not only removes the security detail, but announces it. Ditto with Anthony Fauci, who is a great enemy of all the sort of anti-vax constituency. So again, just putting a target on people's back and then saying, we're not going to protect you. It's the withdrawal of police. Like I said, that's kind of the hallmark. And then elections. So well before Trump was reelected, this on the left is a cover story from the American Conservative magazine, in which they were forwarding the idea that the 22nd Amendment doesn't say that, it says you can't serve more than 2 terms, but it says what they mean is more than 2 consecutive terms. And so, or there's now, this guy, Andy Ogles, just introduced a bill in Congress to amend the 22nd Amendment. The language is really interesting because it would permit Trump to run again, but not Obama. It was really quite tangled. So again, I mean, I don't think this is probably going to go anywhere, but it's obviously in the air, and the first thing you do is you make it normal before it becomes possible. Okay, so I'm ending here. So where are we in the United States? I walked you through all of that because, this is where my flags went up. They didn't go up in Trump 1, I want to tell you. I mean, I didn't vote for him. I didn't like what he was doing. Ordinary politics, you fight, you win the next election. Okay, that's a different thing than this. This strikes me as being totally different. It's very lawyered. A lot of it is designed. So far, we're hitting the courts are stopping all the low-hanging fruit problems, but there's a lot of really seriously interesting lawyering going on here that may well be accepted at the Supreme Court that would grant a huge amount of power to the president, and we've already seen this court go in for that. So I don't panic easily on this stuff, but these first 3 weeks are a really different thing than Trump last time. And what I'm hoping is to persuade, I mean, many of you probably didn't vote for Trump in the first place, but I really want to say something to the people who did, right? It's one thing to get immigration policy, anti-gender fluidity, DEI stuff through, and that's going to be painful to people, and that's a different thing than this. And so what worries me is that when you go through the autocratic checklist, he's hitting all the buttons in the first 3 weeks. So it's not the end. There are things that can be done, and I can talk about that in the Q&A. So that's enough. Thanks. How are we on time? We might.
This was a masterful overview of the terrifying situation that we find ourselves in, to be totally honest. But I'm sure there are many questions in the audience here. Don't hesitate, please.
I was going to ask about the House resolution right now that's looking at 501c3 groups. And
Yeah,
it definitely sounds like the whole,
Yep.
What was another issue we had was the funding of bread in the civil sector.
Yep.
But
Yep.
that's already passed the House. And it's
Yep.
probably going to pass the Senate. What do you what is
Yeah.
the next step in that?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know how many of you actually are on first name basis with the tax code, right? But there's two kinds of civil sector organizations, something called 501c3s, which are universities, think tanks, not political but knowledge producing and civil sector organizations. And then there's 501c4s, which are campaigns, elections, candidates, and so forth. The 501c3s get lots of tax breaks, the 501c4s don't. And many charitable organizations are totally dependent on the tax breaks. Viktor Orban did this. He did it with churches first, actually. So Mr. Christian Europe, if you've heard his latest speeches, at the beginning, one of the first things he took aim at in his first year was the fact that there were 350 registered religious organizations. And they all got tax breaks. It was like a 501c3. They were kind of hardwired into the tax structure. Overnight, he had a supermajority in the parliament, so he would have an idea in the morning, and by noon it was law, including constitutional amendments. So that was another feature of his particular government. But what he did was suddenly came out with a declaration that out of the 350 religious organizations, only 32 would be recognized. And the rest were deregistered. They lost all their tax breaks overnight. They were in like a no man's land because it wasn't clear if they could re-register as organizations of any kind. They lost their bank accounts. And so quite a few of them collapsed and failed. And it was the hit and run quality of it. And he just got rid of all this religious opposition to him, which might have been a mobilizing moral force that could have opposed him. And it was really sudden. It was like over in a month. Okay, so 501c3s, I mean, this has been on the discussion block for a long time. And it passes the House, and we'll see. The Senate, of course, right now still has the filibuster, which means to get to a vote, you need 60 votes to stop the debate and go to a vote, and they won't have 60 votes for that, I think. But we don't know how far this goes, right? And one of the things I'm really terrified about is, if you read Mitt Romney's book, one of the things he said was, why are his colleagues not standing up to this? And they said, look, I'm rich enough to pay for a private security detail. They're not. They're getting threats, not from the other side, but from our side. And there's a lot of threats and bullying and this kind of subterranean violence. Paul Pelosi is being used as an example in these circles, And so the question is, will Congress hold the line, and what do the threats look like that are coming in behind them? And so that could be that's exactly one of the things that I was expecting was 501c3 elimination, or what they may do. I have to look at the exact, we've had a lot going on the last few weeks, so I haven't looked at the wording. But it would be really interesting, and what you get when you get really clever lawyers, they do something like they change the law so that only the opposition groups get hit and the ones on your side don't. Is that what's happening?
Essentially, the resolution would allow, I think it's one of the secretaries or people that Trump is about to install, I want to say from the Fed, to label 501c3 groups as somehow related to terrorism.
Yeah.
Essentially just destroy their reputations, even by getting, it's basically an injunction.
Yep.
And it would be something that whoever is in that position can just hand out to any given 501c3 at any time.
Yep. That's, yep.
Their costs. So.
That was done in Russia, then Hungary, and actually Israel enacted a law like this where, basically you call a group terrorist and then nobody can deal with them, you can't donate money to them, et cetera. Yeah. So, what I'm telling you to do is pay attention, right? Because it's not over yet, right? This is where somebody explaining that, bringing it up, talking about it, shaming, like that. And courts might hold a line on some of it at the beginning. I think there was a question over here or there? Yeah, there.
Good one. Thank you so much for the excellent talk. I want to ask you for your insight. What is in the interest of conservative Supreme Court judges to want to rule over an autocracy? I mean, ultimately, they believe in law. I mean, I understand conservative jurisprudence, but I can't understand necessarily surrendering yourself to fascism. What's in the interest of the Supreme Court to do this?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and you know, I've seen this in country after country after country. So, usually, what it is that, so some of the people on this court and on the other courts that I've worked with are really movement conservatives. You know, they come out of the political movement. They're there to forward the movement. They have some, you know, their judicial role isn't the main thing on their mind. You know, so that is one thing. But the other thing is just that once you get into that kind of position of power, you get a lot of privileges. You know, you get lots of security, you get a private car, you have a good salary, you have an excellent pension, everybody treats you like you're a minor god. You know, all that stuff is really, you know, kind of persuasive. And if you know that your position depends on, when you get far enough into this, your position is going to depend on whether you keep the confidence of the autocrat in charge. You know, so you have to pull out before you get to the stage where you can get bullied into having everything that makes your life comfortable disappear. I know in Hungary, when the Constitutional Court was being captured, that was a court where I'd worked for 4 years. I knew all these people. And the question was, and some of the judges really fought back while the court was being captured, and some of them caved. And I said, like, why? You know, like, I knew these people. And they said, my kid wouldn't get into college. They control that. You know, I don't have any savings. This is my only pension. You know, you see this happening now with military people because so far we haven't gotten the full military readout, but you know, what's happening, my military sources are telling me that lots of the 3, 4, and 5-star generals, that's the political level, right, are all being reviewed. And it's not just that, and most of them could retire, right? 20 years you get a full pension. But the question is, how much is your pension? And the pension is set by the last rank in which you served honorably. And what's now being discussed in Pentagon circles is that the Hegseth folks are coming in, and if you're a 5-star, they might retire you at a 3-star. It's a very much lower pension. You know, because they'll say what you did as a 4-star and 5-star is not honorable because, you know, whatever. So, and they can control those processes, so that's the worry. I mean, it's, at some level, I mean, the question is how much personal trauma do you put yourself and your family through to stand up for the right thing? And at the beginning, when there are lots of people who will join you, it's much easier. The smaller the number of people get who can stand up and do something, the harder it is, and the more people just say, okay, you know, somebody else's turn to do something. And I think that's what ultimately happens to these courts. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to ask for one thing off in my mind about where I came from. Usually, previous president in my country, the South Korea, used their power to remove some of the competitors from the playground by using the electoral campaign law.
Exactly.
And because it is quite restrictive and they are covering very detailed. So when people started to investigate them, it can be easily detected by the prosecutors. And also the prosecutors is managed by the president. But of course, the accused people engaged in some fraud, and the electoral campaign law is crucial for the democracy. But there is some kind of ironic situation like this. How do you think of to protect the democracy from this kind of misuse of the legal system?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And South Korea is such an interesting case. It's almost the case that if you don't get impeached as a president, then something's wrong, right? I mean, like literally, but this is good. I mean, it's been interesting to watch it, right? Because people in South Korea will go to the streets when they think democracy is threatened. Okay, that's a tremendous resource. And in the countries where people have done that, even if they don't have a legal, legal leverage, it often slows things down because, you know, this kind of soft autocracy, which doesn't use tanks, does rely on the idea that you can't repress all the people all the time. And the bigger the resistance gets, it's just too hard to do that. So it's just been interesting to watch, you know, people go to the streets, really defend this. The Constitutional Court has so far really stood up for, you know, anti-corruption and so forth. And, you know, of course, the Constitutional Court's under pressure now in Korea, as I understand it. So, so in general, you know, Korea looks like a healthy democracy. But you're absolutely right. One of the things you have to preserve to have a really healthy democracy is the independence of certain kinds of offices. And one of them is the election apparatus and being able to judge, has somebody violated the rules? And if that process is in the hands of whoever wins the election, they use it against whoever lost it. That's exactly, again, what I said Viktor Orban does. You know, like the election finishes, his people then say, oh, all the opposition parties broke the rules, defund them all for 3 years. Then suddenly they fund them before the foreign, I mean, it's exactly. So, I mean, that's a vulnerable spot. And so there's a number of offices that really have to remain outside of partisan hands and independent to have a really healthy democracy. And the electoral machinery and the election finance policing, you know, that whole thing, if it's not independent, can lead to exactly the cycle that you're seeing. My sense, though, was that some of the more recent impeachments were not for that. For example, declaring martial law when there's no reason is a little bit of a, shall we say, a democracy issue. And the last one was what, giving, like having her private friend, like give all kinds of public benefits to her private, I mean, it was really corruption, you know. So some of them are, you know, technical violations, and some of them are like somebody should be impeached, right? At least if the evidence bears out the charges. So South Korea's really got, I mean, it's tumultuous. I mean, my husband keeps saying, how come they keep electing people who are going to be impeached? Right, that's another question, but you know, but still, I think South Korea is in a relatively healthier place because people go to the streets. I might say the other country that actually is surprisingly good on that is Romania. Romania has just had a whole bunch of, you know, near misses on autocracy over the last 20 years, and people go to the streets. You know, people go to the streets, and they see where, you know, what the problem is. They go to the streets. This was true in Israel when Netanyahu tried this power grab, you know, before the massacre of October 7th, but there was that whole 8 months when like people, and it wasn't just the left that was going to the streets, it was really across the political spectrum. So again, in Poland, there was again big uprising against the takeover of the judiciary. I can think back to Pakistan when the Constitutional Court, when the Supreme Court was being packed and bullied, when people went to the streets to defend the judges. I mean, so sometimes, and people say, what can be done? Okay, so that's one thing that you see in democracies that sort themselves out and kind of pull back to a more democratic system. So massive public protest actually does seem to have that effect. As long as it's peaceful, as long as it's aimed at democratic restoration, that's one of the things that can work. Yeah. Yeah, can I take, yeah.
What do you think it would really take for Congress to get together and actually impeach Trump? And what would actually be the benchmark? You know, they do have the majority in the Senate.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sufficiently old that I was in college when we went through this with Nixon, okay? I'm really old. And what was interesting was that at first the accusations about Watergate were something that looked like a Democratic conspiracy against Nixon. And then as the evidence came out and mounted, people in his own party turned against him and said, look, if you don't resign, you're going to be impeached and removed. And he resigned. Okay, now, it's such a different era, right? Nothing is going to happen to Trump's tenure in office unless sections of his party turn against him. And the party is now constructed in such a way, you know, partly by ideological commitment, partly by a lot of threats and bullying behind the scenes, partly this is the only game in town if you're a conservative. A lot of people are on the Trump train, and I mean, given the humiliation they've all been put under, voting for candidates that are clearly unqualified for the cabinet, I don't see them breaking, right? I just don't think impeachment is going to happen. So, you know, then what? So this is where you got to try other things. Oh, I think somebody needs the room, right? Okay.
Scheduled for 3:55
Okay. No, I know.
Let's please give a big round of applause.
Thank you.